Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillahi, nasta'inuhu, wa nastaghfiruhu, wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek His help and His forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from evil of our own souls and from our bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides will never be led astray. Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leaves astray, no one can guide. I bear witness that that there is no God but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I bear witness that Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His slave and His messenger. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about who I am. I'm a student at the University of Illinois. I'll hopefully be finishing sometime in August, middle August. I'm a graduate student. Originally, what I was researching in school is I was looking at the destruction of Islamic education and indigenous Islamic structures of knowledge through British colonial conquest in West Africa. Now, for those of you that follow the news, the embassy blew up in 2012. Needless to say, my advisor was like, "You're not going." So, other things about me as far as my Muslim history, I've been Muslim all of 15 minutes. Been living according to the dictates of the deen for about 5. So, that's about me. Who I am not an Islamic scholar, nowhere near close to it, but what I am is I'm a seeker of knowledge. You know, I'm particularly interested in knowledge and how we understand knowledge and how knowledge informs the parameters of what we believe is possible or even appropriate, which is largely what this discussion is going to be about. This talk will be specifically about the Islamic understanding of knowledge versus the Western conception of knowledge. Now, in the West or in English, we just call it knowledge, right? However, in Islam, it's called ilm. Now, for those of you that know anything about Arabic at all, you know sometimes the words don't cleanly translate. Well, I argue that ilm is one of those words. I guess just to get started as far as ilm, show you what it looks like. My Arabic is horrible, so I'm going to warn you ahead of time. Okay. Ilm. Now, well actually, or you can do it this way here, or alim, or ilm. It just depends on which way you pronounce it, or whatever. Now, this is the Islamic, the Arabic word for knowledge, but the understanding of what this word is distinctly different. Prophet Muhammad said, he's quoted as saying this: "Seeking of knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim." I mean, can it be any more plainly stated than that? Now, as far as how we understand them in comparison to what we understand in the West as far as knowledge, ilm has a much wider connotation than its synonyms in English and other Western languages. Because what we understand to be knowledge in the West actually falls very short of expressing all the aspects of ilm. Knowledge in the Western world means information about something divine or corporal, which means it tends to be somewhat compartmentalized, segregated with a lot of specificity. Like we have these different subjects, even spelling, reading, English, all these different subjects we have. They kind of have a kind of separated existence where they're kind of distinct from one another. However, when you do have more than one type of knowledge that you're trying to bring into a particular type of project or a particular type of thought, then they call it interdisciplinary. Well, that doesn't necessarily exist in Islam with the discussion of ilm, because ilm encompasses everything. It actually encompasses theory, action, and education. Now, how important is this? How important is this this pursuit of knowledge that we're supposed to be on as Muslims? In the Quran, the word alim, which can be translated as learned, scholar, or wise, has 140 places in the Quran. 140. Alim, you know, alim in Islam a lot of times means the, kind of like your basic terminology for them. Alim, or the knower, 27 times. And all the total number of verses in the Quran in which ilm or its derivative, based on its wasan or its root, are associated is 704 times. And I think that sheer number in itself expresses the magnitude and the importance of how important it is that we try to understand as much as we can about this world while we're in it. However, because it encompasses theory, action, and education, what we understand in this world cannot be divorced from what we try to do and how we try to live from the next. And I think that's the biggest distinction between the Western conception of Islam, the Western conception of knowledge, and the Islamic conception of knowledge. The aids of knowledge, such as book, pen, or kitab or kalam, are almost at the same number. Kalam occurs in 2 places, al-kitab in 230 verses. All of which al-kitab for al-Quran, al-kitab is used as a modifier for Quran, occurs in 81 verses. So what you have is you have all these exorbitant numbers of different references that if you understand the language, which I'm working on, kind of suggesting it's very important that we seek knowledge wherever we may find it. But this understanding of the knowledge is not supposed to be separate from how we live our lives to get to the next world. Now, this implies, those numbers I shared with you, these numbers implies that ilm, or the attainment of which, like I said, is obligatory of all Muslims, but it encompasses theology, also encompasses theology, politics, law, ethics, and wisdom imparted by the Ummah, by the Prophet. The importance of education is not disputable. Now, how Islam understands education is also a little bit different too. Education is the knowledge of putting one's potential to maximum use for this world and the next. One can safely say that a human being is not in the proper sense until he or she is educated. Now, the importance of education is basically there for 2 reasons. It serves 2 major functions. It is the training of the human mind is not complete without education. And that doesn't necessarily mean schooling. One thing I want to caution you guys from is looking at education to mean primarily schooling. Schooling is a lot more than, or education is a lot more than schooling or institutional lessons of that nature. Education makes a man or woman, okay, gender neutral language, a solid thinker, and it tells us how to think and how to make decisions. Once again, these are things that are kind of, in some instances, kind of divorced from the Western understanding of knowledge. Because what you have, and I got this here to kind of draw some comparisons here. What we kind of have in the Western world, as far as knowledge, you kind of have all these things here. These are your different subjects, right? Now, in order to connect these different things, you got all these different things down here, and they call it interdisciplinary, kind of academic terms. Now, what would you say, okay, now let me compare this, and I'll give you the best illustration for Islamic knowledge, okay? I realize I'm taking on a very boring subject otherwise, so I'm going to have you guys help me. What do you see is the biggest difference between this illustration of Western knowledge and Islamic knowledge down here? What's the biggest difference? It's a continuum.
Yes.
Right. So, see these gaps here? Keep those gaps in mind. I'm going to talk about those in just a second. Now, Prophet ﷺ said, made seeking knowledge an obligation upon every Muslim, because he explained this. He actually explained that the superiority of one who has knowledge over the one who merely worships is like the superiority of the moon over the heavenly body. Pretty pointed there. Now, what I want to do is, since we've kind of drawn this connection here, I want to try to get into some commentary, more or less, from some prominent Islamic thinkers that you may know, some you don't, some you probably want to check out after this lecture. As we all know, the history of Islam in America, or Muslims' experience in America, has been long-standing. And the more and more, as I was putting this project together, even doing my own academic work, what I tend to find is that there has been a very long, pointed, and shamefully accurate critique of the way we understand knowledge in the West from Western scholars. The first person I'm going to bring your attention to, his name is Saeed Muhammad Naqib al-Atas. He wrote a book called The Aims of Islamic Education, which really got me started thinking about this. Well, what we have in America is what kind of society? If you have a theocracy in Iran, what do we have here in America? What would you call it?
Secularist.
A secularist, right. Now, secular comes from the Latin word seculum, which has the meaning of time and place. Okay? Keep that in mind as well. Secularism is defined as far as the Western understanding goes, kind of the deliverance of man from religion and metaphysical control over his reason and language. Now, secularism has three fundamental parts. The disenchantment of nature. Do you guys understand what he means by the disenchantment of nature? Can somebody tell me this? What does that mean? I thought you had some Persian to show me, sister. Anybody understand what I mean when I say the disenchantment of nature? The disenchantment of nature. Initially, in the early times of humanity, nature was given a divine orientation to it. We understood it to be this, it was understood to be divine and have this, metaphysical or godlike quality to it, based on their recognition of their lack of understanding. Okay, now what happens when you have the disenchantment of nature? Nature loses that metaphysical understanding, and it kind of becomes open to scrutiny and I guess manipulation is a better word, by mankind in a way that it never was before. Because if you understand this thing to be sacred or godlike, you don't fool with it, right? Well, part of what secularization does is the disenchantment of nature. The second one is the desacralization of politics and the deconsecration of value. Now, what that means is that the removal of divine application from the understanding of authority, right? Meaning, initially, because we had this, because of our, ideally, lack of understanding, we kind of attached everything, we kind of recognized everything that we saw had an origin beyond man, okay? Yeah, that kind of gets lost when you're talking about the desacralization of politics and of values, because that also means you kind of remove absolutes, okay? Now, we all have this thing called relativity, where it's a very dangerous thing, at least to the way that we've taken it in America now. Well, such and such is such because such and such says he is such and such. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, now, moving from there, we've all heard of Tseleq Yusef, right? I'm listening to his lectures and listening to the classes that I struggle to stay awake in my education program. He has to have some sort of background in education, just in the way he dissects these things and understands it. But he says that the whole idea of secularization is very common in society. Everything has been secularized, from the way we understand knowledge to the way we understand truth, to even our understanding of what's possible and what's not possible. And he says we kind of selectively talk about the sacred, but we kind of mention it in a way that takes the teeth out of it. A classic example of that would be what I do. I hate to put it that way, but that's what it is. It's a term that Dr. Sherman Jackson called, it's not a real word, it's his word. It's called social scientification, okay? I am doing a PhD in education, but I'm specifically looking at the relationships and the different processes of learning that black converts have in their experiences and how they come to learn and understand what Islam is through their interactions with immigrant Muslims. That's my dissertation project. Now, the irony of that is, oh, thank you. Just hopefully somebody, when it's time to hire me, somebody thinks that same thing. But what you end up with is, in a sense, that takes the teeth out of it, because I am a scholar, I am a social scientist that looks at Islam, right? But not an Islamic scholar. You see the difference?
Right.
Did you have a question? Okay. Well, what you end up with is, Sheikh Yusef said, when you take the teeth out of it, it becomes just this thing that you kind of set aside. It becomes this personal thing. Kind of relegates religion to a hobby of sorts. You know, you use it when you want to, you use it when you don't. And, well, Islam is supposed to be a continuum. You know, that's the difference between the way we understand truth, fact, knowledge. There's a continuum there where what you understand and what you learn on this earth is supposed to be for a greater good, to get you, and hopefully your fellow man, if that's your job, to the next, right? Well, now, what I did not notice, did you guys notice that secular is on the dollar bill? I actually never noticed that. It's called, well, secular, and he termed it, just meant world. It's on the dollar bill. The world had a moral order that has been under attack since the face of secularism. Now, human science has limitations. Once again, that's our conception of knowledge, right? There are all types of things that we can use human inquiry and academia to research and study and blow lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money on, but we still can't fill in some of these gaps. You understand what I'm saying? And so what ends up happening here is these gaps. See, and here's the irony. I don't know if I made this clear or not. In the event that, like if Muslims, if they took this same perspective of knowledge, right, minus religion, minus the deen, we would have the same gaps. We have the same gaps, but you know what we fill them in with? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does that make sense? Okay, now, when coupled with, he says, when coupled with revealed knowledge, it allows humanity to work within the bounds of nature and not be a danger to it or himself. And a good example of that was seaweed. This is a classic literal example of these gaps that we have here in human understanding. He told a story, he said 5 years ago, which meant it had to be in the early 90s, because this was an old lecture. There were a bunch of marine biologists that went out to the Pacific Ocean. And I don't know how you get money to study something like this, but they wrote a grant, right? And they said, well, one of the scientists said, well, why doesn't seaweed grow wild? And he got a whole lot of money to go figure out why seaweed doesn't grow wild. Now, we understand that everything that we see in this earth and all the processes, we understand it's a byproduct of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His divine grace, okay? We understand that. So there is a naturally or God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala associated understanding for why we see what we see and why we don't understand what we don't. What we don't understand, we said, it's probably not for us to understand. Now I'm gonna get to what happens when we breach these limits of human science in a second. They went out there and said, well, why doesn't seaweed grow wild? So they went back and they took samples of the water, this, that, and the other, and they decided that the reason seaweed didn't grow wild, right, was because there was a iron deficiency in the water that stunted the growth of the seaweed and kept it from taking over the whole ecosystem of that particular area. They decided to do was get into a plane and seeded this particular area with iron pellets. They came back 3 months later, and it was covered in seaweed, growing out of the ocean, like you could see it from the surface. They basically destroyed the ecosystem of that particular area there. Now, in my mind as a Muslim, now mind you, like I said, I'm not an Islamic scholar. I'm just a scholar of Islam, guy trying to learn. But I'm thinking as a Muslim, I look at that and I'm thinking, well, that was an undeveloped area. There's no people there. No one lives there. That means that iron deficiency was naturally occurring, which meant it was that way because it was supposed to be that way. Okay? Now, they went back. They saw that it was seaweed everywhere. I guess seaweed in abundance has a really bad smell. People on on the boat got sick, this and that and the other, people were vomiting, yada, yada, yada. Okay, we have that understanding. At what cost? What did we do? You understand what I'm saying? Does this all make sense where I'm going with this? Now, and even beyond the seaweed example, these gaps provide the balance. You know, our understanding of deen and alim, as we understand it, it connects these dots for us. And I think what you have here is, this is my own little theory. I think these gaps here, the gaps in our reasoning, in the way that we in America, and especially our children, especially pay attention to this if you have school-aged children, because our children are taught, it's an academic word called epistemology, which means way of knowing. In public schools, and maybe even many private schools, they're taught a way of knowing that necessarily problematizes the existence of something beyond them. And I think that becomes problematic. And what you have is we kind of have, science has become meta-religious. When I say meta-religious, it kind of serves as a religion in itself. And we have faith in this science, this Western understanding of science, but there's so many gaps that we can't fill in. And it kind of creates an inner tension. Now, I'm gonna get to that in a second. Now, specifically moving to the next one, the last ideas of Tseleq Yusef. He said, human beings with intellect without revelation is a very dangerous thing. Intellect must be constrained by revelation because it has massive power. Now, I guess the best examples I can come up with that is the atom bomb, and I'll save that example for later. The next one is what you have, and this is kind of what I alluded to briefly before, in schools. It's the internalization of problematic epistemologies that problematize, they're problematic because they problematize the existence of God. A way of knowing or a way of comprehending and assessing reality that has placed distance between themselves and religion. And in this particular discussion, he said what we do with our Muslim youth is we send them to all the way from K through 12, the public schools, then send them to college, all the way up to graduate school with a PhD, and they're taught and they're kind of infused with this epistemology that problematizes God, or at least our understanding of it. And then he says, we put them through all this more or less socialization and expose them to these ideas all these years, then we tell them, reconcile Islam with yourself. Right. You know, kind of interesting. He talked about, well, when I talked about how the Western understanding of science has become meta-religious, he used a term that I'd never heard before until I looked at it, called scientism. Yes, scientism. Science and scientism. Scientism is a speculative worldview about the ultimate reality of the universe and its meaning. Speculative. The key word there is speculative. Right, we don't speculate. You know what I'm saying? The Quran gives it to us clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to us clear. There is no speculation. We have these same gaps, but we understand where these gaps come from. So there's a continuum. Now, despite the fact that there are millions of species on our planet, scientism focuses on the inordinate amount of its attention, on human behavior and beliefs. That's kind of where the relativism comes in. Rather than working within carefully constructed boundaries and methodologies established by researchers, it broadly generalizes entire fields of academic expertise and dismisses many of them as inferior. That's something that I'm going to talk about briefly, because in the age of modern rationalism, and this is some more like nerd type stuff I'm really into, I wanted to really understand the human evolution of knowledge and understanding. And what I now understand as a Muslim is that when you look at the history, first of all, you look at the history of knowledge. Who are we studying? Europeans. Like they're the all-encompassing example of what it means to be learned and knowledgeable. Well, they went through this period called the Enlightenment. where you had your whole periods of positivism, rationalism, all that good stuff. And it was actually at this point that they believed that they started to think that to have your life guided, or to even have your political system and society guided by religious ideals is oppressive. And well, we see where that got us. Now, with scientism, you will regularly hear explanations that rely on words like, and I never thought about this. If you guys go and do a Google search of any explanation of scientism, you will see these words. I actually tested it out. Once again, because I'm a nerd. Merely, only, simply, or nothing more than. Isn't that a very limited way to understand its existence? And I'm sure we've all heard the guy from Harvard, I can't remember his name, but he said life is nothing more than an eloquent dance to nowhere. Well, think about this. If life is an eloquent dance to nowhere and there's nothing to be accountable to after this life is over, you can pretty much do what you want. We see where that's gotten us. Now, I'm going to give you some scientific quotes, okay? The cosmos is all that is over. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Okay. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Isn't that something? Isn't this crazy irony? Because think about it. Do you realize that everything that science tells us, there must be a reason for something except existence? Now, we can be proud as a species because, having discovered that we are alone, we owe the gods very little. That's scary.
Yes.
Now, and I guess to close this particular commentary with Dr. Jackson, what he said about that, he gave the most simple, profound, basic explanation. If we understand science, Western science, right, to be what is limited to the observable, empirical, scientific world, things that we can touch, tangible, put our hands on, those concrete things, right? If that is what science is, right, is not God beyond science? I mean, does it make sense here? So it's kind of like you can say that you can use, and this is my own personal understanding, you can use worldly knowledge to understand things about the deen. Because as far as I'm concerned, not scientism, but science in itself lends lots of credibility to a lot of the things that we read. However, when you try to divorce the two, you're stuck trying to come to your own conclusion about what connects the dots here. And that goes into that inner tension. Now, the inner tension, it was discussed in this is Sayyid Muhammad al-Naqibatas still. He talked about what he called the Western spirit of inquiry. I thought this was really interesting. He said, the Western understanding of knowledge originated with the disenchantment towards religion. So from its very origin, it's not going to be the same. Well, they're not going to understand knowledge, or they're not going to understand religion, and religion isn't going to function the same way as it does here in this country. This disenchantment bore the desire to discover everything, as man came to believe that all things were discoverable. Okay? At the point that you believe that all things are discoverable, you have these gaps. Because there is no recognition of the human understanding and human intellect to understand everything. Who's the only person who understands everything? Say it for me. All right. So we're on the same page. So it leaves gaps in which you must fill in the gaps with our own understanding, oftentimes foolishness. These truths of religion become mere theories, conjecture, and in a secular, rational, empirical society, ideas that inform knowledge, fact, are informed by philosophical ideas that we can deduct from scientific inquiry. So if your reality, right, if your reality is shaped by what you can see and what you can understand and what you can put your hands on, it becomes very easy to become necessarily atheistic. Does that make sense? So, under such a rationale, we are always subject to the shortcomings of our own rationale. And reliance on this dualism of truth and reality creates an inner tension. Now, recognizing no limit in human understanding are pursuits to understand absolute truths, like our existence, like we have in this team, through human reasoning will always fall short. And that kind of goes back to the example I provided for you with the unchecked intellect. Now, think about the relativism we have. Think about, now I'm not one saying, I want to be careful and not be misunderstood to say that I'm a person that believes that's an absolutist. There is gray area, right? There is some gray area with some things, but there are some things that are absolute. Okay, the relativity of a lot of these things is kind of disturbing. I mean, classic example. What's the hottest discussion right now in America? We argue over what a man and a woman is. Think about that. We argue over what a man and a woman is.
They do.
We don't. Yes, absolutely. We're not. I think everybody here is clear. You know what goes where and who belongs to what. But I'm saying, generally speaking, this society, the popular political, social, economic discussion, all of it is revolving around really who gets to be a woman. Who gets to be a woman or who gets to be a man? Last I checked.
The option to.
Right. That's the unchecked intellect I'm kind of talking about. We have, but the irony of it is, what's the biological principle that determines whether you're a man or a woman? Chromosomes, the XY, right? You can have all the sex changes you want, that doesn't change.
Still gonna be.
There's one of those gaps right there. Now, some more commentary. Anybody that follows the whole political discussions as far as terrorism? Anybody ever heard of the Islamic Brotherhood of Egypt?
Yeah.
No, excuse me, the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. Anybody ever heard of Sayyid Qutb?
Yeah.
Sayyid Qutb, and the reason, this is my own little thing, the reason I'm fascinated with him is because he was an Arab that came to the United States, I believe, in the 50s, and he wrote this idea, this commentary in the 50s. Now, what I think makes him unique is that he was an Arab, he was an Egyptian, but he was very, very dark. Very, very dark. You know, I put up, like, what does his brother look? You know, one of those things. He's very, very dark. So I'm thinking part of his experience of America and his way that kind of his critique was based on probably an experience of racism, in addition to being a believer, because you all know it was also around the 50s and the 60s that the Scopes trial and all those things were going on. By the way, you know, being in an education program, there's a handful of believers, you know, in my department, and they always talk about taking prayer and this out of school. Like, well, he could have never came out of the school if he didn't come out of the home first, you know. So, but I digress. He called it a hideous schizophrenia. The same inattention that Dr. Akib Alatas talked about, how you have this dualism that you're dealing with, and you're always forced to try to reconcile something with something else that's always contradictory. He called it a hideous schizophrenia. And I'm just going to give you some of his quotes. He said, "It's not natural for religion to be segregated from this world, nor is it natural for it to be confined to a conscientious feelings, ethical rules, and ritual worship." He felt like when he came to America as a Muslim, he felt like the compartmentalization of knowledge and religion was really problematic. And if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, he sat on the edge. He kind of had started thinking about these things when he went to a public pool, when he saw the men and the women were in the same place, and he saw the women, what he thought was scantily clad. Now, you've seen bikinis in the 1950s. What would he do if he came now? Probably would have killed him. So I think his unique experience of racism because of his complexion, and then being, well, from a Muslim society coming to America, where at the time there was a dwindling recognition of religion and the role that it plays in the public square. He went on further and said, it is not the nature of revealed religion to become an irrelevant plaything. He wrote this in the 50s, okay? He says, a disfigured, hideous, and insignificant phantom, talking about religion, said religion is not supposed to be this way, or a conglomerate of conventional functions completely inconsistent with rules for practical living. And I guess, if Sayyid Qutb was alive, I guess I'd have him look at some of our celebrities, some of our fashion, some of the things that we're taught in school, specifically morals, values clarification, things like that, where everything is relative. He said this in the 1950s, when things were by and large, from our imagination and understanding the world, pretty conservative. You know what I mean? I mean, in the 50s, you know, the whole understanding of shame and haya, pretty much consistent with what we understand in Islam. Not now. Think of the things we do shamelessly. He had this really powerful statement that I'm going to read to you. He says, once man deviated from God's system. Now, before I finish, keep in mind he wrote this in the 50s. Think about this. Think about this simple analogy here. Once men deviated from God's system, they had to continue following fatuous ideologies of their own invention, leading predictably to their present miserable state, wherein individuals suffer from terrible consequences of their ideological shortcomings, moaning from the pain inflicted upon them by their fellow men. Still worse is their ineffectiveness in ridding themselves of their abominable man-made hell. Like I said, there's a lot of money and time and media attention given to who is a man and who's a woman. And I don't mean to pick on anybody for any particular whatever they do or whatever, but it's just the best example of how, I guess, of relativism gone wrong. You know what I mean? As an academic, as a social scientist, that's really a bus driver trying to be all these things. No, seriously. I look at these things and I'm like, I understand, and I guess I will admit to you, this is not a popular view. I'm a social scientist, but I'm also a Muslim. And I frequently have to do double talk a lot of times, because there are a lot of things that I would say and endorse as a social scientist, or even as a scholar of Islam. But if you ask me to speak as a Muslim, I could tell you something completely different. I kind of have to do some double and occasional triple talk. But ultimately, what determines even how I do my research and how I understand to be appropriate is this consistency down here, you know, because one informs the other. They're not compartmentalized or anything like that. But I think that in itself, the fundamental nature of a man or a woman, or what a man or a woman is the best example I could come up with. The relativity of everything is just out of control. In fact, this gentleman named Thomas C. What is his name? Thomas C. Holt. He made a brilliant analysis, and I think this will really speak to everyone in this room. He says that racism is a product of secularism. Now, I would have never made that connection. He said that once you had what amounts to the late 17th through the early 19th century, this period when Europe thought we need to move away from religion, okay, and we need to try to understand things for ourselves so people can freely do whatever we want, yada, yada, yada. This particular period, he summed it up as a transformation in how humans live, thought, and understand their place in the world. Now, what was big during this period is deductive reasoning, rationality, the promotion of the empirical and hard sciences, and classification. Classification. Anybody else know what was going on maybe around the 16th, 17th, 18th century? You know why we're here? Slavery. Right. Well, he makes the argument, and I don't know if it's true or not, but whether it's true or not is kind of irrelevant. I thought it was kind of cool, okay? He argues that even the birth of the concept of race is in itself a type of knowledge that has been the result of man becoming the ultimate author and object of knowledge. Does that make sense? So if you are the author of knowledge and the object of knowledge, you become the ultimate authority. And therefore those with the power get to become those that do the classifying.
It's a social construct.
That's why,
Absolutely.
That's why you have the gaps.
The gaps. Right. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't that's not to say that there wasn't issues related to race or ashrabiya or jins, you know, even in the Muslim world. But what we didn't necessarily have that I know of, and I could be wrong, there was no whole socio-economic and political systems based on the exploitation of another group. Even when you have these people that anybody run across these people that want to take shots at religion all day, every day, and talk about religion is just enslavement, this and that, and they want to subject Islam to the same critiques of Christianity. Well, the irony of that is that most of the people, yes, the history of the slave trade, the Arab slave trade in Africa was, I believe, 150 years, maybe 200 years prior to the Europeans coming. However, it was not race-based. And there's a difference between slave societies and societies with slaves. That was very much a society with slaves. We look at the story of Bilal ibn al-Rabah, right? And we know that he advanced to a prominent figure in society from slavery. And there are several other figures like that. So I guess in closing, my question for you guys is, because I want to get some feedback from you guys. How do you see, well, okay, what are your thoughts on what I shared with you?
Wow. That's the first thought, wow.
Wow, okay.
I took some notes of what, I'm sorry, it sounds like my brother.
Oh,
Excellent
my son.
presentation. Your first 2 minutes would have been enough for me to ponder for a week. So I jumped in and out of here. But some of the things that I wrote down that I was feeling was man's sense of self in relation to nature. When you talked about nature losing its majesty and its importance, you know, is the law says everything that you need you can find in nature. Come on. So what does that say? But if I place myself over and above nature, then I create the gaps because I don't know. Allah's already told me it's all there, right?
And the gaps are there for control.
Exactly.
And he specifically said, do not destroy this balance.
That's
Exactly.
right.
So,
And that's the balance on the bottom.
I also wrote down understanding and accepting, and acceptance versus arrogance, because we become very arrogant in what we do, and the whole Western spirit of inquiry. What are you questioning? What are you questioning? Allah has already told us what it is from day one to the end. And what comes afterwards, do this, you do that, and it's fine. So my question was, because I was thinking, what are your thoughts of the interruption of African to African American religious conviction? And if not for the constructs and the European basis, you know, wow, where might we be?
My thoughts on that. Well, once again, I think that, and these are just my own personal opinions, I think that the relativity that is rampant in society, the absence of absolutes, the absence of a God consciousness, or what we understand to be taqwa, I think that the relativity in itself creates a whole bunch of inherent contradictions. And I guess the best humorous example is these, I call them conscious cats. You know, the cats that walk around Africa this, Africa that. You know, that's great. That's great, being in touch with who you are. But these are Pan-Africanists that are atheists. Last I checked, we came here. Those of us even, now look, we know the numbers are up in as high as 15%, as low as 15%, up to 40%, up to 60, 70%, depending on where your slave port was, fused with Muslims. You know, the slave registries, especially the ones in southern Georgia and in Louisiana, Abdullahi, Aisha, Jihad. Ironically, one slave registry had there was a Nigerian, an Hausa brother named Shaitan. I don't know what that's about, but nonetheless, the pronunciation in itself and the spelling gives the recognition of an Islamic history or some exposure to it. So we came here with this understanding of something beyond us, whether we were Muslim or not. And I think what happens is, let's be honest, guys. You know, a lot of these same Pan-Africanists. It's something that Dr. Abdul Jackson coined Black Orientalism, where it's basically the same as Edward Said's Orientalism in the sense that it kind of looks at everything from a romanticized, pathologized trope of the Middle East. It's kind of the same thing, but what we tend to do with Black Orientalism, in short, is they tend to look at everything through the lens of African American chattel slavery and the African American experience, and you can't necessarily do that, you know. So I think that's just one of the many contradictions you have. I guess my best one is I argue, to the chagrin of many, that there are certain perspectives of even feminism that are byproducts of this. Think about it. I think the best example I can come up with is the whole discussion of gender equality, okay? I'm all for gender equality, I'm not for gender sameness. You know, they're different.
things.
You know, so
Go ahead, keep going.
and so what I thought was really interesting is that this, once again, let's go back to the bathrooms, guys. Okay. You have some brands of feminism that state that men are inherently violent, oversexed, testosterone-driven, violent males that will accost any woman at every opportunity. Then why do you want to be in the bathrooms? You know, those are just some of the contradictions that I think come about. You know, when you don't have, I believe it was a status I put on Facebook. Ishmael's Facebook friends with me. I have a tendency to just say stuff. And I put this thing on there. I was like, you know what? A lot of you, something to the effect that a lot of people wallow in relativity, because when you recognize nothing above you or nothing to be responsible to after you're gone, you are the ultimate author, and you can pretty much do whatever you want. And it's left up to you to make sense of everything, you know, regardless of the consequences that it may or may not have. I'm not one that believes, and even Islam tells us, you know, the whole understanding of ummah, right? At no point is there the things that we do exist in a vacuum, where everything that we do, it affects those around you.
Exactly.
You know, we've never been divorced from individual decision. There's a gentleman named Tseleq Yusef, where he says private decisions have public consequences.
Absolutely.
You know, sure.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me sum this up for you.
Sure.
The treaty of good and evil that he talked about in the Bible.
Absolutely.
That first one.
Right
What you're
here.
talking about, right? That right there. That's the truth. That's the psychology that Allah told us not to eat of. The psychology.
That's very good.
Okay?
I never made that. Yeah, that's
All right?
right.
And the gaps are there for control.
That's right.
And she could bear witness to that because she has a PhD. So many hoops you had to jump through to get it.
Can you help me jump?
Listen,
Jump.
I mean, look, I'm still jumping.
Okay.
But you're correct, because when you talk about education,
Yes.
right, they don't teach you to think.
No,
It's not, it's an indoctrination,
that's it.
okay, of putting you in a direction where you will never be a free thinker. You know, but with Islam, Allah says, come get it.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Here it is.
Yes.
And I was thinking, you know, when you were talking about that, right, because we don't zealously go after all that is there, you know, for one reason or another, you know. Does it set us on center stage that now we have to look inside? Because we're real good looking outside, you know. He didn't do this.
Right.
You know, her hair's hanging out there, mine's is hanging out, you know, kind of thing. But, you know, it's like when do we self-reflect?
Believe it or not, I argue, and I'm speaking distinctly as a black male, and I'm speaking specifically from the perspectives of our community. I think the fact that we have a narrow understanding of education, and we automatically equate education and learning with schooling,
Yeah.
I think that's what served to destroy any fervor for learning and inquiry that our youth have.
Well, see, that's going back to the psychology again. That's the psychology they give us.
Absolutely. I mean, especially as a young black child,
Yeah.
all you're taught is that you were a slave of 15th Amendment, Dr. King.
Who's teaching us? They're teaching us.
Right, but we are they now.
Right.
That's the
Yeah, because of the
psychology.
psychology.
We are they now.
Now we go back to that same conscious psychology they gave us.
And I was also thinking about your gaps,
Mhm.
right? If you don't know Shaitan is in the gap.
There you go. That's another one.
Absolutely.
That one.
Absolutely. Because you see, I think that, and that's the thing, I have a PhD in education, but I guess while most people are trying to understand education and trying to build education, I guess what I aim to do is basically try to deconstruct the way we look at education and understand that schooling is our problem. You know, because think about it, if you take, what is it, you know, compulsory schooling, probably the 1940s, maybe the 1950s up to now, so roughly, almost a little over 100 years, you know, of schooling. What is that, 5-6 generations? You got 5-6 generations of a group that only understand themselves to have a history that starts with a slave.
Right.
Anything you do after that you're not in chains
Exactly.
is a come up.
Right. Right.
If that's your perspective, you know. And sure.
Okay. And then you got to understand, if you study the history of Europe, then you understand the psychology of this Western world
Absolutely.
and where it's going.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I
So getting back to your diagram there, like I said, Satan's in the gaps. And the gaps are there for control, so you can't make a connection. They don't want you to make a connection.
Absolutely.
Because you make the connection, you're going to go automatically to the other side. You will see God in the right light.
Absolutely. In fact, one thing I want to draw your attention to is if you look at the history of education in this country, public education, what you find is that, in short, the goal of education was, is, and will always be subject creation. And the types of subjects that we aim to create through schooling, even up to my level, where we're supposedly free thinkers, the PhD process was a really disappointing experience for me. I thought I was going to be around all these brilliant people, and I am not.
Right.
But
Exactly.
the subjects that these different institutions aim to create is very much influenced by social economic factors. For example, if you look at the early 20th century, the World War II period, we had a lot of wars going on. The auto industry. So what they were doing, skill training, training people, primarily men, you know, handful of women, to go into the factories, build cars, and, you know, build stuff, right? The Industrial Revolution. You get into the 1960s, probably the 1970s, 1980s, that's kind of the growth the STEM stuff. It's an acronym, science, technology, engineering, and medicine. Now you have all these different robotics programs and all this stuff. They're very selective, by the way. Very selective, by the way. I remember the area that I grew up in. There was a suburban public school that had robotics, another one had engineering, and the black school had cosmetology. So, I guess when you look at any of these educational programs, or actually when you look at anything that's sold to us through media or even education, you don't know what you're reading until you know who the author is.
Exactly.
You know, and I can't reiterate that enough.
I just think it's interesting that the oxymoron is that you're taught that religion controls you, and the belief is that religion controls you, but then when you look at Al-Islam, like all our pillars are indications not only just to have taqwa, but to reflect. Like we're told to think and to question and to ponder all of these things. And so it's so interesting because when people see you as religious, they think you just blindly follow everything. And we're taught to believe that a critical thinker is one who adopts this Western ideology, but we can't explain the gaps. And then we just say, well, we're the ultimate author, and we're just not going to know it. We just have to keep seeking, as opposed to understanding that everything is already written and we have to obtain understanding of it, but also question, think, talk to other people, and it's not a blind following by any means. So it's almost like a counter to, and we're all in education, counter to the education process.
Absolutely, and there are lots of, like I said, I really cut this short. There were so many different things that I could talk about, but I think that I argue that one of the, believe it or not, Islam in itself has experienced consequences of this. Now this kind of goes into that very real research I was doing earlier before the embassy blew up. One of the things I was interested in was these particular regimes of knowledge and the hierarchies of knowledge. Specifically what you had in the Middle East. It was after the colonial period ended. It really destroyed I won't say destroyed, the social value afforded Quranic education in a lot of these Islamic societies. It was destroyed in the face of modernization, industrialization, and Western understandings of knowledge.
Right.
And I argue, can't prove it, right? Don't necessarily have anything concrete, but I kind of argue I argue that fundamentalism, and I say it all the time on Facebook, those who are Facebook friends with me know that. I argue that this phenomenon we have called Islamic extremism or Islamic fundamentalism is an ideological response to the imposition of Western understandings of knowledge. And I think what happens with that, continue one second, what ends up happening is that when you, as a colonized people, right, after the colonists have left, after all the Europeans have left, all you have is their schools. But you know what you had before them. So what ends up happening is I feel like they kind of reject everything as Western, even in things that can be useful. Because I think one thing they want to sell, and like on a side note, kind of related, the media does an incredibly good job of selling garbage to a largely ignorant population. What they tell you about Islam, they want to go back to the pre-modern world, they're uncivilized, this, that, the other, yada, yada, yada. But let me ask you something. Do you realize the technical expertise it takes to make a bomb? Never even say, it's just that, and that's the unfortunate reality of being Muslim, especially in America, but a Muslim in the world today, anywhere. Only Islam or only Muslims are faced with the issue of their particular social and political realities being a continuum and accurate representation of their ideas. So when you look at places in the Middle East that are rife with political turmoil, human rights violations, everything, they say that's Islam, all right? But at no point do you look at the treatment of black people here and say, that's Christianity. You see what I'm saying? So it's a lot of stuff that will be sold here. Now, what was your question?
My question was the El-Fatiha, and it's the almost often said prayer.
Mhm.
And it's almost often said for a reason. And the reason is this. At the end, it says, going astray, darling. Okay. Now, if you study the Jewish history, the Christian history, you can see where God guided them and how they went astray. And the same thing is going on with the Islamic world. That's why you see so much chaos in the Islamic world. It's because, one, they hoard the knowledge, same thing that the Christians and Jews did, and not treating the people fairly. By fairly, I mean they're not giving them the correct understanding, the correct psychology of the Quran.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of bleeds into what the Imam gave his khutbah about on Friday.
Yes.
When he talked about how we kind of get wrapped up in things that aren't necessarily necessary,
Yes.
you know, and you know, that's why I say, and I don't know, and I guess my frequent exercise of ijtihad, it could be because I'm a new Muslim, could be, I don't know, but I tend to look at things a little bit differently because I am a student of culture. Actually, there's an article that I actually encourage everybody to read. It's called the Islam and the Cultural Imperative.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Islam and the Cultural Imperative. And he specifically talked about, and this is the thing I think we have to be careful of as Muslims, because, you know, we're taught to have that middle ground, be that middle way, and extremity in any form is discouraged. And I think we forget that sometimes when we tend to think that, this is part of what my research is. I kind of deal with this concept that I call Arabism, where because of the geopolitical and economic and religious power of Saudi Arabia, the image and understanding, the imagery and understanding they have of Islam tends to get propagated. It becomes hegemonic or dominant at the expense of other groups, right, who also practice Islam, practice it appropriately, but practice it differently. And I bring that up because Islam and the Cultural Imperative talks about, it provides several different, actually more than several, many different examples of how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu examples of him showing that Islam was never intended to be a culturally predatory enterprise. And the example provided was that Islam is like the shallow river that flows over the land. It's all Islam, but on some level it's going to take the appearance of the land that it runs over. But it's all Islam. You know, I had a discussion with one young lady who was talking about how she gave up a dance. Now, you know, there are some people have some really strong feelings about that. But what we do have is from the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first Ramadan celebration, the Ethiopians doing their, I guess it was kind of like some sort of jumping thing that they do. And not only did he instruct the critics to leave them alone, but Aisha was sober so she could see. And I'm thinking the principle there. He's awake now.
Hold on to that baby.
The principle there is more pointed than the example in itself. And that's one thing I try to, because look, I'm almost done with a PhD. I'm a hyper-educated clown in a couple months officially. And I do, I guess, employ some of these rationalistic understandings, but I try to employ them within the understandings of Islam. You know, understand that ultimately these gaps are filled in with this,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
And because of that, I do think maybe I'll look at Islam a little bit differently, because like I said, I am a social scientist. And I kind of think, well, maybe we're looking too hard at the examples as opposed to the principle that's supposed to be spoken there. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, he didn't say that, you know, they can't do that. You know, there was no discussion of who they were, this and that. He said, let them play their games more or less. That's who they are. That's what they do. So that's the
culture.
right. And I think that that's amazing, because even in this whole discussion in the work that I have done about Arabism becomes a very dangerous thing, because not only is it culturally predatory, but you have these, it kind of functions to mute out the cultural contributions of all the other groups that come to Islam as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So,
I noticed that when I went to Egypt, like in the northern part, it's not a southern part is like Nubian, but everybody seems like, Arabization is taking over. It's also
absolutely. And I think the issue with Arabization, and let's call it what it is, guys, based on what we established here today, Arabism is a type of knowledge. In a sense, it is a type of knowledge. It's a dangerous type in a sense, especially considering most of the world's Muslims are not Arabs. Are not Arabs, It's so we kind of have this, we kind of tend to have these problematic understanding of what Islam looks like based on this global image of Islam projected by the Saudis. Now, that's not to take a shot at them, it's just a recognition that sometimes this particular image gets promoted at the expense of all the others.
Well, and the problem is that, and for me, most religions, is that we judge the religion by the folk that practice it.
Yes, it's not the
Whether we've established the fact that they're knowledgeable and committed to the tenets of the religion.
Yeah.
Just, you dress like this, so, okay. So I'm gonna believe what you say as whatever it is, only because I see this visualization of what I've been told is Islam.
Absolutely, that's very true, and that kind of goes into what Dr. Sherman Jackson, remember what I talked about earlier, the social scientification of Islam? He specifically talked about how, he said we've kind of gotten to a point where Islam, academia specifically, and the media treats Islam as this enterprise that is whatever someone who identifies himself as a Muslim says it is. And he said, in that, there's a decreasing role of theology in the classical understandings and bare principles of Islam. He said those basic fundamental things that constitute Islam and constitute being Muslim are starting to play an even smaller role. And so we're looking at all these people that are doing these things, and, well, they're Muslim just because they say they were. A good example, there was an article I posted, what was that, last week, about the one that said that this woman, she said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but she said that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the first feminist.
Based on
His, based on his recognizing the humanity and recognizing the talents of women, because during the Jahili period, women were being killed, they were being buried alive, right. Well, with
being treated.
Right. Well, with the birth of this deen, all of that changed, and we know, the stories are all through the Quran. He was very respectful to women. He was cherished. He said the best of you are the best of you are the ones that are the best to your mothers. So he gives props, if you will, to women, and he recognized the abilities of women. He worked for a woman. He recognized the abilities, and so his recognition of the talents, humanity of women, in her mind, was enough to qualify him as a feminist. But I thought to myself, okay, but if that's the case, I'm a feminist.
Yeah, and I was going without qualifying them first, because you have feminists who don't believe in what other feminists say. Right, so what is to be a feminist? What does that mean? You know, and I know we have.
I can't answer that without getting in
But
trouble.
we could have a conversation another time, but I'm just saying, Prophet Muhammad couldn't be no more than what Allah intended him to be. It was his person. It was who he was by nature. He wasn't going out of the way to do anything other than what Allah intended him to be. So if it was to be kind to women, it was a must sanction.
And even a lot of what we know about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what we know about his life came from who?
Well, it came from Aisha. Right, it came from Aisha.
So, but you see, that's the funny thing about it. I'm like, now this is a Muslim woman that's raising her son to be a feminist. I'm like, how do you not recognize that? But I guess when you operate here,
Exactly. Exactly.
you know.
Right, and that's the thing, you know, and we can't allow folks to say things that brings up these arguments and this discontent and disconnection between us. Okay, so you want to say Prophet Muhammad was a feminist, and what? And what? Where we going here? What are we going to do with this?
Yeah.
You know, so and instead of having these large debates about who is, Allah told us who he was. The character of his heart, his honesty. That's who he is. We don't need to get into none of this, into the gaps. Because that's a waste of time.
Yes.
Right.
You
Absolutely.
did an excellent job.
Thank you very much.
I wrote down a couple of things that I was thinking about when you were writing, when you were talking, I'm sorry. One of them was about Republicans. You know how they claim to be Christians, but their entire idea of society is anti-Jesus. Like, right now, a billionaire is someone who is representing them when Jesus said a rich man is like, it's basically impossible for them to happen. You know, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. A rich man came to him and he said, get rid of all this, get rid of everything you have in order to follow me. And it just struck me, but I was thinking, why was it the case that they separated the two? Is it to
Which two were separated?
religion separated from their governance? Is it because they realized that they were going to be doing some things immoral? Because I feel like when you take God out of the equation, it's on purpose. Is it?
You don't do it on accident.
Yeah.
Don't do it on accident.
I'm gonna give you one example of this. I had this T-shirts made called God the Irresistible, right? And a friend of mine, I gave it to him. He wouldn't wear it. He said, because I'm gonna be going and buying beer and buying alcohol or doing something wrong, and I don't want to have a God the Irresistible shirt on when I'm doing it. Right? So, in order to, I mean, it seems like they did it on purpose because they realized they was gonna be doing some things that weren't God-like or godly.
Now, I'm gonna try to remember to send you a lecture. Imam Zayd Shakir, who's, you guys familiar with him? Zayd Shakir, he's one of the co-founders of Zaytuna Institute out in California, the only Islamic graduate school in America. He argues that they argue that religion was taken out of the equation with the establishment of the governance of this country, I believe. I want to make sure I'm attributing the idea to the right person. I believe it was Zayd Shakir, don't quote me on that. But he talked about because they intended for this to be a place that was diverse. Because ideally, America was founded on the principle of religious freedom. Because the Queen of England wouldn't allow them to practice whatever it was they practiced, whatever strain of Christianity it was. Yeah, right. And so, but the irony of that is if you go into, I believe it's the Library of Congress, there's like murals and everything painted on the ceiling, there's only one religion up there. Islam. Islam. Yeah. Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. So, I don't know, I think that's the argument that they made, because I will tell you what, and what I do know about Zayd Shakir is he makes a very compelling argument that there are elements of secularism, and I agree with this, he felt like there were elements of secularism that as Muslims we can be okay with. If you want to say that no governing religion, there should be no religion used to govern a diverse society, as long as preference is not given to one and people are free to practice theirs. He said, we have no problem with that. I'm like, okay. But he said at the point that, he said we kind of practice a fundamentalist secularism. And it's gotten to the point where these gaps have become so pronounced and actually so numerous. I could probably draw these things all the way around the building. That what we got now is people are actually hostile towards religion. And it's kind of like anything that you do or don't do that based on your faith is not even, there used to be a time, even when people weren't religious at all, even if they didn't share your faith, there would be a time when they respected that you did it because it was your religion. Now we have situations where women are being jailed for wearing a hijab. There's just nothing sacred. Nothing, there's no respect anymore. I can't remember who I was talking to, but there was Germany has its own sort of public assistance or something like that. And a lot of the Muslim women, Muslim families there that are on public assistance, the government provides jobs for them, I guess earn their keep or something like that. Don't quote me on this, but he said something like they were trying to get these Muslim women to work as sex operators, phone sex operators. And that's it was like every job that they provided them with was something that would have them engaging in something that was haram. And I think that's just an example of the lack of respect that people have for their faith, for anybody's faith, So I think that's kind of where we are, and I think that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. I look at a lot of these gaps here, and I'm interested in knowing how fragile the line has to get before it's just unstable and everything falls. Because even Tseleq Yusef said hubris is what has destroyed a lot of great civilizations when they have no recognition of anything beyond them. And that horrible word we have called morality, talks about how that has destroyed whole civilizations. So,
well, then again, you got to look at how different ethnic groups, history were, not the history, but the social being was destroyed. If you go back and see how it was destroyed, then you will see how it came up.
Absolutely.
What not to do.
Absolutely.
And that what not to do.
As a matter of fact, let me leave you with this best example. The best example of how nothing is sacred. As Muslims, we respect Christians, Allah Kitab, people's book. Have you guys actually heard, somebody actually released the Queen James Bible.
Queen?
Queen?
Wow. Shakespeare's wife? I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry.
But they say you that way. They say
Shots fired!
they say you that way.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great election.
That's what I hear.